Good morning, Seth. I have Seth Godin with me. How are you today?
It's a thrill to be on the phone with you. It always is.
Well, thank you. It is for me, too. And today we're going to do something special. We're going to talk about the role of storytelling in sales and marketing. I've heard you say that in order to be successful, you need to be a leader, even if it means you're leading a small group. The key is to be able to spread your ideas. Now, it seems to me that stories are the perfect way for a leader to provide people with both the will and the way to follow.
Well, human beings are story processing machines. I was listening to John Hodgman read from Areas of My Expertise, and he starts by saying that he could tell you that Frédéric Chopin was a Polish pianist who lived from this era to this era, and he composed several symphonies. Or he could make up a story. He could say that Frédéric Chopin was a composer who was obsessed with ladybugs. And while he was performing in Poland, where he was born, he would cover his head and his arms, his long spindly fingers, with ladybugs. Now, once you add ladybugs to the information, it gets way easier to remember who he was and what he did, even if the ladybugs aren't the core of what you would read about him in the encyclopedia. And the reason is simple. We don't need facts on the savannah when we're running away from Neanderthals or mammoths. We need stories, and our brain is very good at representing and remembering them. The reason that we're afraid of stories as a leader is we feel like if we just tell people the facts, they will make their own conclusions and we won't be responsible. And my challenge to people starts with saying, do you have the guts to lead? Because if you don't expect the rewards you're hoping for. But if you do choose to lead, that means emotionally connecting with people who choose to follow you.
Right. In researching for today, I went back to one of your books, All Marketers Are Liars, and right on the very first page, you make the statement that either you're going to tell stories that spread or you will become irrelevant. Now, that's a pretty strong statement, and I was wondering if maybe you could begin with telling us what you meant when you wrote that.
Well, to be irrelevant means that people will choose someone else. I can think of businesses that I deal with in my selection set, not because I've compared them to every other person who does the product that they sell or the service that they offer, but because their story matches what they do, their story resonates with me, and I've heard it from other people or told it to other people. So a simple example, you might go 10 blocks out of your way to buy an ice cream cone from a certain vendor in town, even though along the way you're going to pass 3 other places that might be even better. But you don't try them because it's the story and the word of mouth that got you to the important place that makes shopping there valuable.
Right. I can tell you a story about my dry cleaners where I must go by at least 10 other dry cleaners, and I drive maybe as much as 30 minutes to get to them. And I wouldn't go anywhere else because over the last 10 years, things have happened. Stories have been created as a result of what they have done for me and the things, gone out of their way. I mean, I could tell you that they've delivered things to my home on an emergency, which is the first time they realized how far I was coming. There's no, when I tell that story and to other people about this dry cleaners, they go there and they say, yeah, I'll give them a try. And then later they come back and say, you were right. I'll continue to do that too because, it appealed to their emotions, just what you just said. When I hear or read a good story, personally, I find myself becoming part of the story. Sometimes I'm just an observer, and other times the story is so close to home that I become part of it. I'm right there as I read or listen.
But now we need to get to the meat of the issue, which is that skeptics are listening to what we're saying, and they're saying that's great when it happens. And that's a nice byproduct of digging in deep and doing your job properly. And my argument and I want it to be controversial, if you really understand what I'm saying, it will be, is your job is to make the stories. Doing the stories on purpose is what you are supposed to do. It's the emotional labor of your work. The work you do that you think is your job is actually the sidelight. It's making the stories true, inventing stories worth spreading. Walt Disney built this from the ground up when he built Disneyland and then Disney World. It's not an amusement park. It's a story-generating machine. You can do that with your business. You can say, what are the stories we're going to tell? How are we going to make them true? How are we going to live them? Oh, and also, by the way, we make shoes.
Right. People act on emotion, not reason, and you need to capture their hearts with your stories, and you do have to be able to make those stories up. I know I usually use real anecdotes when I tell stories in sales. It's easy for me to go back and create, bring up an anecdote that actually happened and put that person in that. And I think that's my job as a salesperson or as a marketer. One of the successful stories is the story of the Jared Fogle story, with Subway, the guy that lost like 250 pounds or something like that by eating Subway sandwiches. And yet that story almost didn't get told by marketers because they thought it was too controversial.
Yeah, I mean, you don't usually get a job at Subway because you want to take big risks. And so it went against the story they told themselves about what they do. I want to take this to a really prosaic level because I don't think people are still aware of how powerful this is and how imperative it is that they take it on. 20 years ago, I helped run a summer camp up in Canada. I had a long history there, but I hadn't been there in years. And I needed to manage and lead a bunch of 18, 19, and 20-year-olds that I didn't have a real connection with. I brought up a pad that I got the idea from my friend Zig Ziglar. I brought up a pad with me, size of Post-its, and on it said, I like blank because. And for the first week and a half of camp, every time I caught one of my 90 staff members doing something right, I ripped a sheet off the pad and I wrote their name on it and what they were doing, and I handed them the slip. No prizes, no system, no money, just good job, and I walked away. And the first 2 days, all these jaded post-teenagers looked at me with skepticism. But after about 5 days, I started noticing that these little notes were showing up on people's clipboards and on the walls of where they slept. And after about a week, people who hadn't gotten one started saying to me, what do I need to do to get one of those slips? And it created a legend, a story that people could tell themselves. Well, I went to the 75th reunion for this camp 2 months ago, and 20 years later, there are people who still remember getting this slip of paper from me. They don't remember anything else about 1990, but they remember this slip of paper. That is the act of storytelling.
Right, and that's a great story. So, do stories need to be designed?
Well, I think that they must not be cynical. They must not be manipulative. You can't say, how can I trick people into believing or telling this story? When we look at Howard Schultz at Starbucks, and I think we can argue successfully that that's a multi-billion-dollar story. That's all that the entire business is. Howard lived a story. He didn't manufacture one. Mm-hmm. He went to Italy. He was entranced by what happened to him at the cafes, and he brought back his version of it. And over the years, when they were doing well because they indoctrinated people into the story. And in fact, one of his most senior people has written a book, and as far as I can tell from the book, all this guy did for a living when he was at Starbucks is live and tell the story of what it meant to be Starbucks. I don't think that's the same as putting a couple evil marketers in the back room and manufacturing a story. And we certainly see that happening. I would argue that some of the large beverage manufacturers who are busy trying to sell corn syrup by a different name keep inventing stories in the back room. And those stories rarely turn out to be true. The problem with lying when you tell these stories is you're going to get caught. And when you get caught, either it blows up in your face or it just slowly declines. But either way, it's a bad outcome. On the other hand, if you live the story, then as long as the story is really true, it will fuel your business, and then your business will fuel the story, and the cycle goes on for a really long time. It gets resilience.
Our friend Bernard Nuremberger asked me, he said, McKinsey has talked about the fact that some companies have a particular cognitive bias towards, themselves, so that their stories are not ethical. And he's wondering, how do you keep them ethical? And I think you just answered that, and that's to live them.
That's right.
And they're ethical.
I mean, a lot of this depends on who you're rewarding and why you're rewarding them. So, we hear stories of people like Warren Buffett. Why is he so legendary? Well, I think it's because he goes out of his way to great pains to make sure that the story he's telling is one that he can also live. And we compare that to somebody who's clearly putting on a show, to somebody who says, look, if you can't take a joke, screw you. That kind of person, inevitably, their stories crash and burn all around them. I'm not necessarily saying you have to be a Boy Scout. If we look at someone like Iggy Pop or someone from the Sex Pistols, they lived a story as well. And they might die from their story, but it's true. They're living it. And that authenticity resonates with people. It's the difference between the Beatles and the Monkees. The Monkees were not authentic. They were actors pretending to be in a rock band. And so we remember them fondly, but we don't travel across the country to see Davy Jones in concert. And so let's get back to the heart of what we're talking about here, which is that plenty of people have decided that they are not like rock stars, amusement park operators, or even your dry cleaner. They have opted out of the unique personal craft of telling a story, seeking out the refuge of fitting in and being fact-based. And I meet these people every day. And there's nothing wrong with it unless you're frustrated. There's nothing wrong with it unless you're trying to grow. There's nothing wrong with it unless you think you're not making enough impact in the world or enough money. If those are the cases, stop trying to work more hours doing your average work for average people. That's not the answer. The answer is to have some guts and actually tell a story. And I'm just stunned. The website of the day to rip off is Facebook. In the last week, half a dozen companies have pitched me on their Facebook knockoffs. Well, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to say, oh, Facebook's the biggest website in the world. We're going to do something just like Facebook, but a little different. Mm-hmm. Facebook isn't succeeding or failing because of a feature set. They're succeeding or failing because they invented and sold and own and tell and live a story. Now, if you want to be making a dent in the universe, you're going to need to tell your own story, and it needs to be one that's yours, not a slightly cleaned up version of somebody else's.
Right. I noticed this morning that there were several news articles touting the new Facebook already.
Right.
So, why do you think people are they afraid to tell their own story, to have their own story, or do they just don't know how to do it?
Oh, there's no question that they're afraid, and it's evolutionarily based. You've probably heard me rant about this before, but just think about the fire, the campfire 100,000 years ago outside of Germany, where all the Neanderthals and post-Neanderthals are sitting. There's 10 or 15 or 20 people around the fire. Someone takes the lead and tells a story about their prowess in hunting or something else that will resonate with the rest of the group. That's risky. Because if you tell a story that enrages the elders, or you tell a story that alienates you from other people, they might throw you out of the village, away from the fire, and you'll get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. There's an evolutionary reason why most members of the pack want to be in the pack. The center of the pack feels like the safe place. So we all, we see this in every seminar we go to. There's 100 people at the seminar. The speaker, who took a big risk by standing up in front of everyone else, says, any questions? No one raises their hand. 2 minutes of awkward silence. Then finally someone asks a question. Then maybe a second one comes along. Then the moderator says, I'm sorry, we're out of time. In that moment, 20 more people want to ask a question. Or they want to go up to the front and quietly ask the speaker something privately. Why is that? Why didn't they just ask a question at the beginning? And the answer is because putting yourself on the line feels risky. And my argument is it used to be. It used to be that if you told the wrong story around the campfire, maybe they would throw you out, and maybe you would get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, and maybe you would die. But now, the way you die is by not telling a story. The way you fail is by hiding. That fitting into the middle of the pack is not the solution, it's the problem.
So how do they get over that fear?
Well, that is the topic for another day and another interview with someone who's smarter than me. I have some thoughts about how you can do it, but I can tell you that everyone needs to do it in their own way. Steve Pressfield wrote a great book called The War of Art, and I would start there with this talk about the resistance. One thought from that is that plumbers never get plumber's block, but writers get writer's block, and yet plumbing is arguably more difficult than writing, because everyone knows how to talk, but not so many people know how to do plumbing. Point is, we are afraid of writing. We're not afraid of plumbing. So we need to acknowledge that there's a fear thing here before we can start addressing it. And then there are plenty of ways to address it. You can meditate. You can sit with the fear. You can write the fears down, which is one of my favorite techniques. You can understand that anxiety is nothing but experiencing failure in advance. You can find a mastermind group or a coach or peers who will push you to do these things. There are countless books and professionals who can help you, but the biggest problem to date has been no one has called your bluff and said that you're actually afraid. That's what I'm doing. That's my value add here. I'm telling you you're afraid. Now if you want to succeed, you better do something about it.
What do you tell someone when you hear a story and you know it's not authentic? You can feel it's not authentic.
What do I say to the storyteller?
Yeah, what do you say to them?
Well, I think it doesn't take very many questions to get to the nub of the truth. Usually, I repeat their claim back to them with a question mark at the end. Mm-hmm. They say, we have New York's best coffee. You have New York's best coffee? And you do that a few times in a row when they make claims, and you can pretty much dig down to finally they say, well, it's just marketing. Well, I'm just selling you something. Okay, that was obvious, but it's not going to work. So let's get to the nub of what's your real story. What story would you like to tell? What story would keep you up late at night working to make the story true? Because I don't want to hear that, you're the best insurance salesman in Westchester County. That's just bogus.
Sure. Katzs Deli, for instance, their story is, they have a lot of different stories, but I think their real story is the fact that everyone else tells their story. By that, I mean, we've all heard, or at least the listeners today, I'm willing to bet that a good many of them have heard of Katzs Deli in New York. And they may never have been there, but they know that if they got a chance, they would go there. I don't think anyone, if they saw the place, would pass by and not stop in. Yet the deli itself, I mean, you stand in line forever, and it's kind of quirky, and there's a whole lot of things to their story. But the bottom line story is they have great food, and people love it, and people love the experience they have when they're in there.
Well, this is a very important thing for you to bring up, which is not everyone loves it. I wouldn't go in there.
Right, you
$1,000. First of all, I'm a vegetarian.
Right.
And secondly, there's 10 other places within a block where I'd much rather spend time. A key thing that Katzs has done is they have said, we don't care if you don't like it here.
Yeah.
And that's part of the story. Part of the story is, if you don't want your hot dog steamed, hit the road. Part of the story is, if you don't like this shtick, that's okay. There's a place right next door. It's when you try to please everyone that it's so difficult to tell a story. And that's a risk, right? It's a risk to tell a story that's going to offend some people. There are many people who would not be happy opening a restaurant where when a vegetarian walked in, you had to say to him, leave. But that act of living it that way, or the Carnegie Deli, another tourist trap in New York City that does great, what's their story is they'll give you a pound of pastrami when you order a pastrami sandwich with a loaf of bread. Now, a pound of pastrami and a loaf of bread for $16 is either a really expensive sandwich or a really great value when it comes to a story to tell your friends when you get back from New York. And I've told many stories about the Carnegie Deli and times that I've been there. I went once with a friend who wanted me to meet a good friend, a client of hers from Japan. And so we go to the Carnegie Deli. This was years and years ago when I ate stuff like that, and ordered the pastrami sandwich, and everyone just ate way too much. And we're walking out, and this Japanese guy who didn't speak very much during dinner gets sick all over the pavement, and he's very unhappy. Well, it turns out, he confessed to us later, that the night before, his other firm had also taken him to the Carnegie Deli, a real New York experience. So this poor guy who had eaten nothing but sashimi for the last 3 months had to go to the Carnegie Deli 2 nights in a row, and it was killing him. That's a great story, right? That we serve food good enough to make your Japanese clients sick.
Right.
And that's the question. Are you prepared to go that far in the way you live what you do in order to have an impact on the community that you serve? And almost every business I interact with, the answer is no.
I talked to some people yesterday who have, what I noticed is they are serial storytellers. They go from one story that they have to another story that, because they think their first story wasn't, good enough, I guess, to another story. And along the way, they're doing the same thing as someone who's not telling a story about themselves because they're unhappy, they're miserable, they're not getting to where they want to be. I couldn't figure out, I'm not a psychologist, but why do people continue to tell different stories when they know they need a story? They understand that, but they just can't settle on one.
Well, but of course you are a psychologist because you know exactly what you're doing when you're selling to people. There's a lot of comfort from telling many stories. One reason is that if that last story didn't work, maybe the next one will. Years and years ago, Henny Youngman came to my house, and he was doing a concert. My dad was the guy in charge of bringing in the talent to the company Christmas party. And Henny Youngman could not stop jumping from story to story to story, because if you want to please an audience, throw enough stuff at the wall, something's going to stick.
Right.
It's a good defensive way to be sure that there's something for everyone. I'm much more interested in people who tell one story and do it really with vigor, because what the web has done is made it so I don't need, for example, a winery that sells wine at $3, $30, $300, and $3,000 a bottle. If I'm going to buy a $3,000 bottle of wine, I'd rather buy it from someone who only sells $3,000 bottles of wine, because they've made a statement in their selection to say, if you want $2 Chuck, we don't have that. Go to Traders. But if you want something amazing, we're the people to call on. That's what you need to have the guts to do, as I wrote about in The Dip, to be the best in the world at whatever you define the world to be.
Right. I used to call that, and I still do today, I used to say people have to learn how to focus. And in sales, for example, if you're focusing on, yourself, or you're focusing on the commission you're going to make, or whatever, winning the award as the salesperson of the month, if that's your focus, you're not going to do very well, especially in the long run. And I think that sometimes people's focus, when they're trying to get their own story, they're approaching it from not the customer standpoint, not something that someone might really want that they could be really passionate about, but their own needs. They say, okay, I can, I'm good at X, so I'll go ahead and build an X, and everyone will come and want my X. And that's not a good story.
That's
and yet,
exactly right.
We both probably see that a lot.
That's right, because who do we live with all day? We live with ourselves. And living with yourself means that there's a noise in your head that's always going on about what you're good at and what you're bad at. And you're very focused on the part that you're bad at, and you're thinking hard about how to let people know about the part you're good at. What that leads to, I think, is this me storytelling, where you mistake the question, how are you, with an actual inquiry as to how you are. When really what people are asking is, how am I? And that's what they want to hear the answer to.
That's good. I wonder if there's anything we can say about the actual creation of stories, if that's something that people need to learn, if people have questions about, like, how do you create a story? Where do you start? If I'm starting from scratch and I just got out of college and I'm looking for a job, or maybe I haven't found one and now I'm thinking I've got some ideas. How do you create your own story? What's the first step?
Well, the first step is clearly deciding that telling stories is important. Once you decide, then you need to notice. So one of the things I like to do when I meet people is I say, how did you get this job? And the answer is almost always an answer that begins with, well, it's a funny story. And then they tell you the story. And it turns out it's not funny, but they tell you a story. When you hear those stories, you're hearing real, honest people tell you a story that they think is funny. You need to figure out which ones resonate with you. You need to figure out which ones resonate with other people. Then it makes sense to go watch 10 or 20 TED Talks, because all TED Talks are stories. And if you look at the difference between the talks that rank very high, and the two that come to mind right now are Ken Robinson on education and Jill Bolte Taylor on her stroke of genius, those people are giving you no facts whatsoever in their stories. I mean, you can summarize both of them in a paragraph, but they're telling great stories that resonate, that will help you remember those facts for a long time to come. Then you practice. Then you figure out places you can go to tell your 10-second story or your 30-second story, your graphic story, or your 5-minute speech story. And when it works, you do it more, and when it doesn't work, you don't. I gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches for free before I got paid to give one. And you learn a lot when you stand up in front of people who don't have to pay attention and discover that they choose to.